There's a quiet truth about children who grow up ignored. They often become adults who struggle to believe they deserve attention at all. They walk into a room and feel like they must shrink. They enter relationships and wonder if they're too much. They succeed in something, but instead of celebrating, they wait for it to be overlooked, as if invisibility is their natural state. This is not because they lack talent or worth, but because the foundation of their sense of self was built in silence. Psychologists call this an internalized neglect schema. It means that over time, the brain wires itself to expect neglect, to anticipate dismissal, to assume that needs are a burden. A child who is ignored enough times eventually learns not to ask. They convince themselves that wanting love, affection, or understanding is somehow wrong. Have you ever seen a child standing in a crowded room, quietly tugging at their parent's sleeve, waiting for even the smallest glance, the smallest acknowledgement? Maybe you've noticed it on a playground, in a classroom, or even in your own family. The child who doesn't cry the loudest, who doesn't demand attention, but instead retreats into silence. On the surface, it might seem like nothing dramatic is happening, but inside that child's mind, something profound is unfolding. Because for a child, being ignored isn't just an inconvenience. It feels like a deep fracture in the very foundation of their sense of self. And here's the painful truth. Childhood neglect, whether intentional or unintentional, doesn't always look like abuse. It doesn't always look like cruelty. Sometimes it's simply absence. Sometimes it's the unanswered questions, the lack of eye contact, the forgotten birthday, or the parent too busy, too tired, too distracted to notice. But the psychology of the ignored child runs deep. It shapes how they see themselves, how they view the world, and even how they build relationships decades later. We often assume children are resilient, that they bounce back from almost anything. And yes, children do adapt, but adaptation is not the same as healing. When a child learns to live without acknowledgement, they adapt by shrinking themselves, by hiding their needs, by convincing themselves they don't matter as much as others. And this adaptation, though it allows them to survive childhood, can quietly haunt their adulthood in ways they may not even recognize. From a psychological perspective, acknowledgement isn't just about feeling good, it's about survival. Research in developmental psychology consistently shows that children need 3 core things to thrive: safety, stimulation, and connection. If one of these is missing, their development is affected. But connection, being seen, heard, and valued, is the one that shapes the child's sense of identity most directly. John Bowlby, the founder of attachment theory, argued that secure attachment, formed when a caregiver consistently acknowledges and responds to a child's needs, creates a foundation of trust. That trust then becomes the blueprint for future relationships. But if a child is ignored, if their needs are met with silence or inconsistency, they don't just feel disappointed in the moment. They internalize a dangerous belief. Maybe I don't deserve love. Maybe I'm not important. This isn't exaggeration. Studies in neuroscience show that when a child's attempts at connection are repeatedly ignored, their brain interprets it as a threat. The stress response is activated. Cortisol floods the body. Over time, this can rewire their nervous system to expect rejection. Their baseline becomes anxiety. Their emotional regulation becomes fragile. And yet, from the outside, they might just look like a quiet kid. When a child is outright mistreated, the harm is obvious. But when a child is ignored, the damage is more invisible, more subtle, but just as real. A child might stop asking questions because they expect no answer. They might stop showing excitement because no one responds. Over time, they begin to disappear, not physically, but emotionally. Psychologists sometimes call this emotional neglect. Unlike physical neglect, which leaves scars you can see, emotional neglect leaves scars hidden beneath the surface. These scars often don't fully appear until adulthood, when the ignored child tries to build intimacy, chase dreams, or find meaning, and runs straight into the quiet, unhealed wounds of their past. For example, many adults who grew up feeling ignored report struggles with low self-esteem. They hesitate to share their thoughts, believing nobody really cares. They may fear rejection so deeply that they avoid relationships altogether. Or conversely, they may desperately chase approval, bending over backwards to keep others happy, because deep down, they're still trying to earn the acknowledgement they missed as a child. Imagine being 8 years old and running home from school with a drawing you're proud of. You hold it up to show your parent, but they're busy on the phone. You try again at dinner, but the conversation passes you by. Eventually, you put the drawing away and you never mention it again. Now imagine this happening not once, but dozens, even hundreds of times over childhood. The child learns that excitement, pride, even joy are things best kept to themselves. And years later, as an adult, that same person might struggle to celebrate their own successes, dismissing them as unimportant. The ignored child becomes the adult who ignores themselves. Research confirms this. A 2019 study in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry found that emotional neglect in childhood is strongly correlated with chronic feelings of loneliness in adulthood, regardless of social environment. In other words, even if that adult has friends, family, or a partner, a quiet emptiness often lingers inside. Most parents who ignore their children don't do so out of cruelty. Often it's the result of stress, economic hardship, mental health struggles, or simply not understanding how critical acknowledgement is. A parent working 2 jobs may have little emotional energy left. A parent dealing with depression may struggle to notice their child's bids for attention. And in the modern age, digital distractions, phones, screens, endless notifications, pull focus away from family life. But intention doesn't erase impact. To the child, the absence feels the same regardless of why it happens. That's why understanding the psychology of the ignored child matters so much, because awareness is the first step to breaking the cycle. Ignored children often develop coping mechanisms that at first glance can even look like strengths. Some become fiercely independent, learning to take care of themselves early. Others become high achievers, striving to finally earn the acknowledgement they crave. Some become peacekeepers, avoiding conflict at all costs in order to keep a fragile sense of connection alive. But beneath these strengths is often exhaustion. The independent child grows into an adult who struggles to trust others. The high achiever becomes the perfectionist, never satisfied. The peacekeeper becomes the people pleaser, unable to say no. And perhaps the most heartbreaking adaptation is the child who stops trying altogether. The one who concludes, if no one cares anyway, why bother? This child often carries apathy into adulthood, struggling with motivation, ambition, and hope. Ignored children rarely talk about their experience. Because how do you explain what it feels like to be invisible? There's no dramatic story to tell, no event to point to, no scars to show, just silence. Just the memory of moments that should have mattered but didn't. And that silence itself can become a barrier. Adults who grew up ignored often hesitate to seek help, fearing they'll be dismissed again. Therapy clients sometimes minimize their experiences, saying, "Nothing really bad happened to me." But the absence of something essential is itself a trauma. It's like growing up in a house without air. Just because you survived doesn't mean you were breathing freely. The long-term effects are real and measurable. Research from the National Institute of Mental Health shows that adults who experienced emotional neglect as children are at higher risk of anxiety, depression, and difficulty forming close relationships. Another study from Harvard's Center on the Developing Child points out that consistent acknowledgement in childhood strengthens neural pathways related to resilience, while neglect weakens them. Put simply, acknowledgement isn't a luxury. It's a developmental necessity. This doesn't mean every ignored child is doomed. Many grow into compassionate, thoughtful adults precisely because they know what it feels like to be unseen. But it does mean their journey is often harder. It means they have to spend years unlearning beliefs that were planted in them before they even knew how to question them. So where does healing begin? Not with perfection, not with instantly becoming confident, but with recognition, with the simple but powerful act of saying to yourself, "What happened to me mattered. My needs were real. My pain is valid." For the ignored child who grew into an adult, the first step is often giving themselves the acknowledgement they didn't receive. And though that may sound abstract, it can be surprisingly practical. It can be as small as pausing to celebrate your own wins, as small as saying your feelings out loud, even if only to yourself, as small as daring to believe that what you think and feel matters. Because the truth is, acknowledgement isn't something you outgrow. The need to be seen doesn't vanish with age. It just goes underground. And the journey of healing is about bringing it back into the light. Think about how this shows up in friendships. An ignored child often becomes the quiet friend who listens deeply but struggles to share their own struggles. They may be the person who always shows up for others but rarely asks for support in return. To the outside world, they may seem selfless, but inside, there's often a lingering ache. Why don't I matter as much as others? This isn't selfishness. It's simply a longing for balance that was never given. In romantic relationships, the patterns can be even more profound. Some adults who were ignored as children become desperate for affection, clinging tightly to anyone who shows them attention. Others go in the opposite direction, keeping emotional distance because closeness feels dangerous. Both reactions come from the same root: the fear that love will disappear, the expectation that their needs will not be met. And yet, here is the paradox. The ignored child often becomes one of the most empathetic adults you will ever meet because they know the sting of being unseen. They have a heightened sensitivity to the emotions of others. Studies in developmental psychology have shown that neglected children often develop strong observational skills. They learn to read faces, tones of voice, and small shifts in mood because their survival depended on it. They had to sense when it was safe to speak or when silence was the only option. That hyper-awareness can become a gift in adulthood, but it also carries a heavy cost. They may tune in to everyone else while tuning out themselves. There's another layer to this, one we rarely talk about. When a child is ignored, their sense of identity can remain blurry. They weren't mirrored back, meaning their emotions and thoughts weren't acknowledged enough for them to feel real in the eyes of others. So as adults, they may constantly search for validation, not because they're shallow, but because they were never given the chance to fully see themselves reflected in the love of another. Identity grows in connection. Without that reflection, selfhood becomes fragile. But here's where something remarkable happens. The human mind has a resilience that is almost poetic. Even when a child grows up ignored, they still carry a quiet hope. That's why so many ignored children as adults seek healing. They read books about psychology. They dive into self-discovery. They go to therapy, or they journal their deepest thoughts. They are not content to live in the silence they were raised in. They want to break it. That desire alone is proof of strength, and healing is possible. Neuroscience has shown us something extraordinary, something that rewrites the story we were once told about pain. The brain is not fixed. It is not frozen in time. It is alive, fluid, adaptable. It can change, rewire, and learn new ways to exist. This means that even if a child grew up being ignored, even if their earliest memories are filled with silence instead of comfort, their story does not have to end there. The brain that learned to survive by being unseen can learn, slowly and beautifully, how to be seen, how to connect, how to trust. Each new experience of safety, each moment when they speak and someone listens, begins to rewrite the old neural map that once equated visibility with danger. Every time they express a need and it's met with care instead of dismissal, the brain takes note. It's safe now. I can exist here. Every boundary that's respected, every honest conversation that doesn't lead to abandonment, all of it becomes evidence, soft and steady, that the world is changing. The nervous system, once tuned for hypervigilance and withdrawal, begins to relax, and slowly, drop by drop, these moments of connection wear away the stone of old wounds, carving new pathways, new possibilities, new definitions of love. Healing doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always arrive in grand gestures or dramatic tears. Sometimes it looks like something small, but profound. It looks like finally saying to a friend, "Can I tell you something that's been hard for me?" It looks like daring to whisper, "I feel hurt," instead of burying the pain behind a polite smile. It looks like sitting in silence with yourself and realizing, maybe for the first time, my feelings matter, my needs are real, my existence counts. These moments might seem tiny from the outside, but inside, they're revolutions. They are quiet acts of rebellion against years of silence. Each time a once ignored child speaks, they are defying the invisible rules that told them to stay small. Each time they choose honesty over avoidance, they're rewriting their entire emotional DNA. And yes, none of this is easy. For someone who grew up being ignored, the fear of rejection can feel almost physical, like a shadow pressing against the chest. To speak up feels dangerous. To set a boundary feels selfish. To ask for help feels like weakness. The mind whispers, what if they leave? What if they don't care? What if it happens again? But courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the act of walking forward while the fear still trembles inside you. And every time they do that, every time they risk being seen, they repair a small piece of themselves. It's also important to understand this. Parents who ignore their children are not always cruel. Sometimes they are simply broken in their own ways, carrying unhealed stories of neglect from their own childhoods. Sometimes they were too overwhelmed by life, too consumed by survival, too lost in their own emotional fog to see what their child truly needed. This does not excuse the pain. The wound is still real, but it helps us understand that neglect often travels across generations like a silent inheritance, passed down not out of malice, but out of blindness. When an adult begins to heal from being ignored, they are doing something far greater than personal healing. They are breaking a chain that may have stretched across decades, perhaps even centuries. Think of it this way. Every ignored child who learns to speak their truth becomes a parent who listens more closely. Every ignored child who learns to value their emotions becomes a friend who holds space for others without judgment. Every ignored child who learns to love themselves becomes a partner who gives love without losing their own identity. Healing, then, is not just personal, it's generational. It ripples outward, quietly transforming families, friendships, communities. It changes the way love is expressed. It changes what children inherit. Because when one person learns that they matter, they begin to teach everyone around them that they matter too. And maybe that's what healing really is. Not an endpoint, not a destination, but a wave. A wave that starts inside one person's heart and slowly spreads, touching everything it meets. A wave that says, I was unseen once, but now I see myself. And because I see myself, I can see you. So if you're still learning how to speak, how to ask, how to feel, know that you're not behind. You're rebuilding something ancient, something sacred. You're giving voice to the silence that generations before you never had the words to break. Healing ripples outward, and it starts with you. And this brings us to one of the most important truths, a truth that quietly hides beneath so many smiles, so many calm, collected faces. An ignored child often grows up believing their existence didn't leave a mark, that their absence was easier to bear than their presence. They carry the weight of silence like an invisible backpack, heavy, unacknowledged, and always there. But here's the deeper truth. Their story does leave a mark, a powerful, aching, human mark. Because in that story of being unseen lies the story of every person who ever felt invisible, the journey of invisibility, and the long, quiet fight to reclaim visibility holds an almost sacred power. It's the kind of power that doesn't shout, it whispers. It reaches people who are still sitting in the dark, wondering if anyone notices them. When that ignored child, now grown, begins to speak, something extraordinary happens. The silence breaks, not like a violent crash, but like the first crack of light through a window that's been shut for years. By sharing their truth, they send out a message that travels far beyond words. You are not alone. Every time they dare to heal, they unknowingly give permission for others to do the same. Their courage becomes a quiet revolution. Their voice becomes an echo that reaches other hearts, hearts that were once told to stay quiet, to stay small, to stay unseen. So if you were that child, if you ever sat in your room wondering when someone would finally knock, if you ever stared at the ceiling, holding your emotions in because no one seemed ready to hold them for you, if you ever questioned whether your presence truly mattered, let me tell you something now. It mattered. It mattered then, when no one saw. It matters now, even more, because you are still here, breathing, feeling, growing. Healing isn't about pretending the pain never existed. It's not about erasing the past or proving that you've moved on. Healing is about rewriting the meaning of what happened. It's about taking the moments when you were unseen and turning them into moments of self-recognition. It's about giving yourself the love, the gentleness, the validation that you should have received long ago. It's about learning to see yourself not through the eyes of neglect, but through the eyes of compassion. The kind of compassion that says you were always enough. You were just surrounded by people who couldn't see it. Being ignored shaped you, yes. It carved scars that took years to name, but it does not define you. It never did, because even in the shadows, you were forming something powerful: empathy, understanding, depth, the ability to feel what others can't put into words. The psychology of the ignored child is not just a story of pain, it's a story of evolution. How silence can become strength, how loneliness can become wisdom. It's the story of a soul that learned to listen so deeply that it can now hear the unspoken pain of others. And in that transformation lies something almost miraculous. The child who was ignored often becomes the adult who refuses to ignore anyone else. The adult who listens, who notices, who reaches out, not because they have to, but because they remember what it felt like when no one did. That's where the beauty lies. In the imperfection, in the messiness, in the raw humanity of choosing to care. In that choice, they find something profound. They were never truly invisible. They were simply waiting to be seen by themselves. And once they finally see themselves, the world begins to see them too.